So as we already established, we are all taxonomists. And whenever we look at an object or an organism, our mind subconsciously is already categorizing it. It's trying to put it in a box. It is alive, is it a plant, is it an animal, is it poisonous, is it edible, etc. Okay? So for a very long time, we're very interested in how things look. And how things look, or shapes, or form, or morphology, it's very connected and many times shaped by their function. So for example, have you ever wondered why a desert rabbit has these very large ears when compared to an Arctic rabbit or bunny that has very small ears? And do you think then the desert rabbit it's related then to the desert fox, or is more related to an Arctic fox that, as you can tell, follows the same patterns of very large ears in the desert and very small ears in the Arctic? So what's the function, what's the adaptation there? Or how about this Madagascar lemur? Why do most lemurs have very large eyes? What kind of light are they adapted to see in? And this particular lemur has a very long middle finger. What is the adaptation there? Or what is the function that this form has adapted to? Most of us are very clear why giraffes have very long necks. They are trying to reach very tender leaves high up in the tree. It turns out that actually also this particular tree, that could be an acacia or not, but if it is an acacia trees develop protection, mechanical protection, which are thorns or spines. And believe it or not, it's expensive for plants to have extra mechanical protection. As expensive as for a farmer to put extra fencing to protect tender leaves from herbivores. So acacias, not all, but some species of acacias, develop these thorns only on the edge or the outside of the tree, not necessarily all the way here in the top of the tree. So if an animal, let's say like this giraffe, has adapted to have a much longer neck to reach those very tender and not so protected leaves in the top, then it has an advantage and it will leave more offsprings. And that's how we have more giraffes. And this form versus function, or function shaping form, it's valid also in the plant kingdom. So here you can see a gymnosperm plant, a tree in the Arctic with very small leaves that have a harder time, or they're better protecting from frost. They also have very reduced water level concentrations. When compared to this tropical banana plant, which is adapted to have very large leaves, so it can take advantage of all the amount of sunlight that it hits on it. It has no problem with frost because very seldom, or if it did freeze in an area, then nobody would grow banana plants there, right? So form and function. As I said, function is shaping the form. And people have looked at this comparative morphology, or comparing shapes. Morpha in Greek means shape. So people compared organisms according to their shapes for a long time. And according to that, they were able to put them in the same group. Are they related or they're not? And now we know that that could be misleading. If you remember the story of ichthyosaurs versus a whale or a dolphin or any others in that group of mammals that returned to water. So occasionally, when people compare morphology, find out that a group can radiate. If you remember from patterns of macroevolution, we talked about adaptive radiation, in which one group can differentiate in numerous other groups that adapt to different other niches. In this case, these structures that have the same ancestors, but then they radiate or adapt and morphologically diverge to adapt to different functions, are called homologous. And we know that the word homo, like in homogeneous, for example, means the same as opposite to heterogeneous, or homozygous versus heterozygous. So these structures, even though now they can look very different, and I'll show you pictures in a second, they have evolved from the same common ancestor. But then they diverged, so that's why we call it morphological divergence. So a very good example is referring to four-legged vertebrates, tetrapods, that have very similar anatomy and morphology of their four limbs. But when we look in detail, they have adapted to different modes of locomotion. So if you look at this picture, we can see a much earlier group of tetrapods, reptiles, that have evolved, or actually they have given rise to, they adaptive radiated in large arrays of four-legged organisms with adaptations to flight, such as this Pterosaurus, which in translation it's nothing else but winged lizard, or birds. Chickens are not really using their wings to fly, but nonetheless, the morphology and the structure, so in this case, the anatomy of the bones of the four limbs of chickens are very similar to this stem reptile from which they have evolved from. And then you can look to penguins or porpoises, so a bird and then a mammal related to whales and dolphins, so in the larger group of cetaceans. Those two have evolved to swimming. So in this case, the forelimbs of both penguin and porpoises are very reduced in size, and they function more like flipper in fish. Well, if we go lower here, we look at a bat, which is also a mammal, but it's a flying mammal. So in this case, the phalanges have elongated tremendously, and a piece of skin would connect it all the way to the abdomen to make these wings of bats in this case. And then we can see our own arm, so four limbs in tetrapods, and that includes us too. And we can see a very long humerus and the radius and ulna and phalanges and carpals and metacarpals, which are pretty long and similar to an elephant's long humerus and forearm bones, ulna and radius, but not as sturdy, as we do not walk on our hands. While an elephant has to put a very heavy weight on these bones, so they have to be very strong. While we have released the phalanges and actually the whole forearm by walking vertically. So they don't have the same strength to hold the whole weight of the body. Well, when I look at our legs, we can see the femurus much stronger than the humerus here in the forearm of humans. So this is a very clear case of homologous structures. They come from the same common ancestor, but they morphologically diverged to adapt to different modes of locomotion or usage, from flight to swimming to texting or walking. And this is a very similar picture of very common animals that we all can envision how their forelimbs would look like. And you can see how different the adaptation of swimming versus flying or just walking on the forelimb or not walking on the forelimb in between these four tetrapods are. We can see the same pattern of morphological divergence of leaves in flowering plants. And you can see here an Asian pitcher plant, Nepenthes, that has the tip. So this is only the tip. The pitcher is made by only the tip of the leaf, and it could be quite large to hold up to a quart of liquid, rain, in which insects can drown and then they can be digested. Or a part of the leaf in this Venus flytrap, Dionea muscipula, which has adapted to respond to motion, which is very unusual to plants. And they can do all that just by moving water from one tissue to another. So, but these are actually modified leaves. And speak about modified leaves, when you buy poinsettia for Christmas, you are buying them because they have these beautiful red leaves. Their flowers are very small, and they're right here in the center of these red leaves that are called bracts. The adaptation there is that if the flower is very small, then pollinators wouldn't seed the flowers. So if you have these very bright leaves around it, in this case red, but they could be other colors, pollinators will have a much easier time. They'll be queuing in and coming for pollination. And when you look at cacti, most cacti have lost their leaves entirely, and they only maintain their midrib or some of the ribs of the venation of the leaves, and in that case, they became spines. So the midrib or some other venation of the leaf became spines to protect the otherwise very fleshy stem that is now the photosynthetic part in a cactus. So again, this is morphological divergence, and these are homologous structures, modified leaves, to perform a different function, but just photosynthesis like most leaves do. But this can happen to the opposite extreme too. So instead of coming from one point and spreading out to numerous other types, other functions, in this case, morphological convergence, you come from 2 points and end up at the same look or overall look. So if you remember the ichthyosaurus and the dolphin that we just talked about it not too long ago, this is a case of morphological convergence. And in this case, we call those structures analogous. They look similar, but they're evolving from different groups as a response to the same environmental pressures or needs. So swimming or flying or so on. So we call that morphological convergence. And one example would be wings that have evolved numerous times. And in this case, we can look at a bird and a bat versus an insect. And we already know that the birds we just talked about it, the birds and the bats have already homologous forelimbs. But so they have the same general anatomy to them, but not exactly. If you remember the phalanges in bats are extremely elongated, where the phalanges in birds are very short. And the other adaptation that's different here, you can see skin as the main wing material versus feathers that have evolved in dinosaurs actually as a means to preserve heat, not necessarily for flight. But so even though they have the same origin of skin, so if you burn feathers, they'll smell like keratin, which is the main protein that makes skin, but also hair and fur and nails and hooves and so on. So even though they have that convergent, they actually have a different adaptation to the modes of flight. And when we get this much farther distant out group here of insects, and we know not all insects have wings, but some insects have wings. And when you analyze it, obviously they don't have a skeleton, they only have an exoskeleton. And that exoskeleton is not made of keratin, like skin and feathers, but it's made of chitin. And chitin, interestingly enough, it's the same chemical that makes the cell wall in fungi. Okay, so I'm going to try to spell chitin right here. Okay, and a little homework for you. What is chitin? It's chitin polysaccharide. Is it a protein? What type of macromolecule is chitin?